Hey folks, welcome back. So previously we've looked at the lovely Agents of Dune box set from Modifius for the Dune role-playing game. Today we're going to look at the core rulebook, Dune Adventures in the Imperium. Now we've covered some of the basics when looking in the box set, and I'm going to skip a lot of the background stuff because I don't know how many of you have read the whole Dune series, including like the prequels, which I don't necessarily recommend, but they do exist. But I'll just give you the basics of the setting for those of you who don't know. If you haven't read Dune, at least the first book, you really should. Personally, I think Dune plus Dune Messiah are kind of one book in a way, so they kind of go together really well as a complete story. Anything beyond that is up to personal taste. If you want to continue the saga, it goes thousands of years into the future. The last two books in particular get pretty crazy. But there's loads of great stuff and ideas in there for further intrigues and characters in your campaign. So I enjoyed all 6 books on different levels. But for me, the first and the second are the true classics that, to me are kind of unsurpassed so far in the history of sci-fi. But, that's the kind of thing where I read them when I was 12, and everything that you do when you're 12 is like the coolest thing ever. So, bear that in mind. But I got to say, this book is really brilliant. They've adapted the 2D20 system fantastically to the Dune universe. On the back, there's really a lot of words, so I'm not going to read the whole splurge here, but basically, the rulebook contains everything you need to create your own stories of intrigue and adventure on the sands of Arrakis as agents of a powerful house. A brand new version of the 2D20 system, adapted especially for the Dune universe, including rules for creating a house, and architect play where you become the puppet masters, moving agents to your designs. An extensive look at the Imperium, its society, factions, history, etc., guidelines for novice and experienced GMs on how to run Dune-themed campaigns of intrigue and adventure, and an introductory adventure, Harvesters of Dune, which I will also skip over. And I love that there's a dedication here to Frank Herbert, author and creator of the Dune universe, whose singular vision and imagination have inspired us all. I very much agree. But yeah, it's a lovely piece of work. It's also beautifully written, and the visual design I think is really great. Of course, we get a lovely version of the cover art without the titles on it, just for that added flavor. But yeah, the graphic design and layout throughout I think is excellent. I think they won one of the Emmy Awards for best writing when this book came out, which was not too long ago. The line is expanding rapidly, of course. There are books beyond this one, including Sand and Dust, which is a book about Arrakis, which I have. There's another, which I forget the title of, which I also have. There's the Houses of the Landsraad, the Great Game, which I also have. And I just placed an order for the very latest expansion, which is about the Imperium itself and a wider view of Imperial space. So I'm looking forward to that. You can see there's tons of stuff in the TOC here, but we'll just sort of jump right in. In the beginning of each chapter, you get a beautiful 2-page spread. Here we see Fremen with a thumper getting ready to thrust their maker hooks into the side of a gigantic sandworm and hopefully ride it and not get eaten by it accidentally or drawn into its sand vortex of doom. And you can see throughout there are these motifs of hexagon patterns throughout the book. There are interesting sort of bits of graphic design around every number, every page. It's just a really interesting and exciting book to look at as well as to read. They give you a nice little summary here as well of how the 2D20 system in Dune differs from the other 2D20 games like Star Trek, Conan, Homeworld, etc. It says that basically things are essentially the same in that you use d20s to beat a target number, and you can use focuses or spend momentum, threat, and determination to modify the result. However, your character's drives are coupled with the skills to create a target number. Each drive uses a statement, similar to values or truth statements, to determine why your character is making the test, not just whether they pass or fail. And Dune uses only d20s. There are no challenge dice, the kind of d6s that were in the other games, including Star Trek. Here we have a much more visually appealing outline of the book. So we start out with an intro to Dune, to role-playing games, to what's in the book. And then we start out with the current status of the Imperium of humanity around the galaxy, with a particular extra attention paid to Arrakis, Dune, the desert planet. Then we start looking at the rules of play by creating a noble house, and then creating a character within that house. And then following that up with the core rules of the system. And then there's a chapter on conflict, of which there are many types, which we just talked about a little bit in the Agents of Dune video as well. There's a whole chapter on assets. So this is largely lists of different types of assets for different types of conflicts, from espionage to warfare to duels, etc. And then a large part of the end of the book is devoted to game mastering, which is really helpful. I think it's quite a challenging system to GM because there's so many types and ways of conflict. A lot of the way that you interact with the Dune universe could vary hugely. You might be a great house in the style of the original books, like House Atreides taking over Dune, as you are in Agents of Dune. You could be a minor house on a different planet with nothing to do with the spice trade. You could be a major house trying to become a great house. There's so many things that you could get involved in. And you have to be really ready for improvisation in a game like this where, players' talents and skills and, use of momentum can really shift things rapidly under your feet. But they've got great guidelines for GMs in here. Then there's a whole wide array of allies and adversaries, which is, again, really helpful for the GM. Everything all statted out for all kinds of generic NPCs and also named characters from the series statted out for you as well. And then at the end, we have Harvesters of Dune, which is the adventure for starting players, but we will skip that, of course. So what is Dune? Basically, this short section just kind of outlines why the book is so special and what made it special when it came out. The essential story is that we follow the life of a young man, Paul Atreides, who's the heir to the throne of the powerful great house of Atreides. So they get chosen to inherit planet Arrakis, which is the source of the spice melange, and this spice can only be found on Arrakis and is vital to the galaxy because without it you can't do interstellar travel whatsoever, basically. So having Arrakis under your control is both potentially extremely profitable and also very dangerous because everybody else wants it, and they'll do anything to get it, and there may be ulterior motives for giving a house control of Arrakis besides letting them take an important role in the Imperium. So Dune worked in this kind of idea of a futuristic humanity where thinking machines were banned due to an ancient war with AI. So humanity had evolved itself using different methods of severe training. So there are all these interesting different types of characters introduced in the series. Of course, we learned a lot about the structure of the Imperium and the feudal politics that drive the galaxy. And it created a world that spoke a lot to new themes that hadn't appeared in sci-fi before, like the last part of the original novel is a huge section on the ecology of Arrakis, and he had actually used a sort of complex systems approach to, how ecologies live and interact, and to me it was quite mind-blowing at the time, and I believe that in no small part contributed to what the kind of research today I do as an academic in a weird way. So they talk about all that, and then they introduce what a role-playing game is, which I hope you would know by now, and then we outline the universe of Dune, but also there's a nice sidebar here mentioning that there's kind of two main modes of play in this game. So at the architect level, say you're the spy master of your house and you're playing at architect level, you wouldn't be physically going to a place and, infiltrating, say, a Harkonnen factory or whatever. You would send your agents to do that. And so these are your assets. You control them, give them orders, and, they would be your pawns in your game of espionage. If you play at agent level, this is when your character is involved in a scene. You're trying to cut a deal. You're trying to, make progress with negotiations with, the Spacing Guild or something like that. And games often will flow fluidly from one type of mission to another. One session may contain both types of play or focus on just one. But it's important to understand that, if you're playing characters in a noble house, you'll need to operate on both scales at different times. So then we go into the details of the background of Dune, which again, I'm going to skip over largely because some of you may want to discover this for yourselves. We'll be able to talk about some of the basics. So it also goes through different eras of play that are possible. I mean, some of these are sort of barely possible with what we have currently in the line. It is my understanding that Modiphius plans to release era source books so that, for example, if you want to play a fleshed out game during the period of the fourth novel, God Emperor of Dune, there'll be a book for that, things like that. What we have now can basically cover most any type of game in the Dune universe around the time of the Atreides inheriting Arrakis. But when we get into further eras, we get sort of more and more distant from the themes of the familiar first couple of novels and the movie, if you have seen that recently. So I expect there will be probably a God Emperor supplement, the Heretics of Dune era supplement, and then the Chapter House, and maybe even the horrible sequels from Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson as well. And there's a nice example of play. Again, we see this sort of hexagonal design theme running through everything, which is kind of interesting. Lovely to have an example of play in the beginning with just one page, but it gives you a taste if you're a new RPGer. Again, we have a beautiful 2-page spread to open Chapter 2. I love that they use quotes from Princess Irulan, which of course we saw throughout the original books as well, to start each chapter. So here we get about the history of the humanity, which is divided into BG, before Guild, and AG, after Guild. So basically, the time when the Spacing Guild was introduced and the secrets of interstellar travel were really opened up, that's when it kind of, humanity really changed and the modern Imperium began. So the Imperium has been running for about 10,000 years, I suppose. But yeah, again, I'm not going to get into all the details of this stuff, but there's a lot of background here about the Butlerian Jihad, which was the war against the AIs, that led to the fall of the thinking machines, and then the birth of an empire, and then the gradual development of the great schools, which provided sort of human replacements for what thinking machines used to do. So instead of computers and machines as calculators and data analyzers, we developed human mentats who have the same skills and in fact can do things that thinking machines can only dream of. And we developed the Suk Doctor schools. The Bene Gesserit developed their intense control of internal body systems and biochemistry, all that kind of stuff. Then the great companies developed the Spacing Guild that controls all interstellar travel, the CHOAM Directorate, which is kind of controlling basically every economic contract in the galaxy. And then we have the Great Convention, which is basically an accord between the Emperor's Throne, the Houses, and the Spacing Guild. So there are various rules inherent in this convention, and they outline in particular one of the most important ones, because some players may seek to try and be cheeky about this. One of the key facts laid out in Dune is that people use laser guns, but people also use personal shields, which slow incoming bullets and make them effectively useless and harmless, and can protect you from blades and all kinds of stuff. However, if a laser gun hits a shield, you get what is basically an atomic explosion, and that can be incredibly devastating, of course. So part of the Great Convention is that laser guns cannot be used in any circumstance where they might hit a shield and cause an atomic explosion. And whether it's accidental or intended, that house doing this accidental explosion would break the Great Convention, and it basically says any house that knowingly or unknowingly breaks any of the rules of the Great Convention will be crushed. The Landsraad, the sort of collective of houses, cannot afford to allow any other option. The errant house will be destroyed, its holdings divided amongst its peers. For the players, their characters, their families, their house, this means the game is over. No warnings, no excuses, no apologies, no quarter. So if you try and get a player who tries to game the system by saying, well, I'm going to coat everybody in shields and charge towards the Sardaukars, laser guns, or the reverse of that, then the consequence is that the game is basically over. So don't do that. So we developed this kind of delicate balance of power in the galaxy, and each of these factions, including the Emperor themselves, the Spacing Guild especially, are extremely secretive and protective of their secrets. So everybody's trying to withhold a monopoly on what they add to the equation. So the Swordmasters of Ginaz are battle-trained warriors of exemplary skill. It's really hard to get into. The Bene Gesserit they have their agents basically scattered throughout the galaxy because they're A, hugely useful, and B, they're the only ones who know how to do the kind of training that they do. Similarly, the Spacing Guild are the only ones who have the ability to create guild navigators who use the spice to plot safe travels when folding space to move instantaneously across the galaxy. So all of these, let's give the timeline as well for spoiler reasons, all of these different main factions that are in play have their dirty secrets that they don't want revealed. So there's many interesting things that can happen in the Dune universe when those secrets are come upon, and things might be discovered that shouldn't be discovered, and enemies can be made, and bad things can happen very quickly. So then they give a kind of overview of the Imperium in its current state, current meaning basically the time of the novels when things start to happen. So there's the three great factions, as I mentioned, the Landsraad Alliance of the Houses, the Emperor and his sort of army of feared Sardaukar soldiers, the Spacing Guild, and the business conglomerate known as CHOAM kind of oversees all the interactions between them. The Spacing Guild also has its own bank, and they kind of act in lockstep with each other. While there's lots of secrecy between these different elements, they maintain a certain balance that allows peace within the galaxy for the most part. Even warfare is regulated closely by the rules of the Great Convention, but more on that later in the book. Then they talk about the importance of the spice melange, which has a lot of different medicinal powers. So it bestows extra longevity, it enhances your awareness of your environment, but most importantly, it allows prescient visions of the future. And that's why it's so valuable to the Spacing Guild, because basically, without the ability to see forward into the future, it's impossible to plot a safe pathway through interstellar space, and space travel would be impossibly dangerous, as it used to be for a while prior to the discovery of spice on the planet Arrakis. And Arrakis is the only place where spice is produced, and if you read the books, you'll find out why. I'm not going to tell you now. Then we get an intro to each of these factions in a little bit more detail. So the Spacing Guild, the Chom Directorate, the Imperial's terrifying Sardaukar soldiers, life within the Imperium. This is interesting because they talk a little bit more about sort of the normal folk. Basically, life this far into the future has gone back to sort of feudal peasantry. The great houses are the noble houses. Everybody that lives under their domain, they do basic work and trades that provide wealth and benefit and exports to the house. The nobles then sell it on through Chom, which distributes all the exchanges. And basically, you're just a cog in the wheel that serves those of higher caste. And it is a caste system, essentially. There's very little hope of advancement. Your best chance, if you want to try at all, is to find a job within the noble house, maybe as a guard or a servant, and try and catch somebody's attention. But very, very rare that a normal person would ever make an impact in the greater Imperium. You have to be born into power, essentially. Then we have some differentiation here between the Imperial House, which holds the Golden Throne on Khaitan, the Imperial capital world. And then they have, of course, unparalleled opulence. The wealth the Emperor has at his disposal is of a level never before conceived of in human history. The noble houses are divided into kind of major and minor. So major are those that control at least a whole planet, probably more than one planet. Minor houses may control a single planet or moon or part of one or an industry on a planet, for example. And each of them will be served by tons of commoners as servants. Unfortunately, there is slavery in this future, but primarily it's kind of legal, but it's not really practiced except for by the Harkonnens, who practice proper chattel slavery in the sort of old United States shameful tradition. So the Harkonnens are the real bad guys in the setting, of course. They will do and say anything to get what they want, and that includes buying and selling human beings. Then we get into the technology of the Dune universe. So basically how they use transportation, which is through the Spacing Guild only. Then there are less advanced forms of transport to get from planet to orbit or from planet to planet. Information technology, household technology, personal armaments. So because a lot of people have personal shields and the laser gun shield interaction is so dangerous, weaponry has evolved to meet this challenge. So most people have hand weapons, bladed, pointed weapons, or hidden darts and needles with poison. Generally, you try to kill people through subterfuge or through close-in combat rather than bombardment with laser guns. Because a single stray shot could basically lead to the dismantlement of your entire house. Of course, then we get into the great schools. So these I mentioned before. We have the Bene Gesserit, which is all female, and they train their sisters to have an incredible amount of mental acuity and the ability to control everything that happens within their bodies on a biochemical level. We have the Order of Mentats, who turn humans into sort of cogitators that replace what we used to do with computers. And they can have unerringly accurate predictions of statistical behavior and even human behavior. Then we have the Suk School. Suk School produces doctors that go through an extremely painful and sometimes fatal process called imperial conditioning, which makes sure that they never can willingly commit harm to anyone under their care. That makes them extremely valuable and extremely expensive. But the Suk doctor training is so flawless that even the Emperor uses them for his own personal care. And we also have the Sword Masters of Ginaz. They tend to serve as personal bodyguards, security officers, stuff like that. They produce the finest warriors in the Imperium outside of the Sardaukar of the Emperor himself. And there is some debate about whether the swordsmanship of Ginaz is up to the standard of the Sardaukar, but that hasn't been tested so far as I know. Then we have an interesting section on faith and religion in the future. So upon the establishment of the Imperium, they developed a form of sort of universal religion called Orange Catholicism. and it was kind of incorporating a wide range of religious creeds from Old Earth and trying to be sort of religion for everybody, basically. It was very controversial. Many people rebelled against it, but nonetheless, today, many people are part of the, as they call it, the followers of the OCB, the Orange Catholic Bible. Some people are more pious than others. Some people just pretend to be so. Then we have a sidebar here about the Zen Sunni. So they were a mystical sect incorporating elements from Zen Buddhism and Sunni Islam. And basically, they were persecuted and scattered and fled across the galaxy until they eventually settled on Arrakis, where their faith formed the core of the Fremen religion. So there you go. It's difficult to be an atheist in the Imperium, and they explain why. Here, most people seem to agree that there is some sort of something beyond the natural, and many will study the Orange Catholic Bible even if they have no intention of believing in it, because knowledge will be useful in certain interactions or certain concepts. So the Bene Gesserit, they have their own rituals and beliefs. They are quite knowledgeable about the OCB, and they view religion more as a tool than as something to be believed in. Nevertheless, they will have detailed knowledge often of the faiths of other societies and other places across the galaxy. Then they talk a little bit about the faith religion that develops in certain areas around the universe, which are more isolated. Common folk across the universe develop their local beliefs. But even then, the Bene Gesserit have the Missionaria Protectiva. This arm of the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood basically seeks out these kind of new faiths and plants ideas within them, so that wherever the sisters go in the galaxy, often there will be magically local faiths that incorporate the idea of a sort of reverend female figure coming from elsewhere to help them do something. So they manipulate religion even on that scale, even on the scale of local sort of folk beliefs. Then we get into some details about the Landsraad and the Great Convention, the caste system, and the functioning of the noble house. Things like control of holdings, hereditary procedures, stuff like that, and legal processes that underlie the Landsraad, which is the high council of the noble houses, kind of. And when there's a change or a transfer of assets between houses, as we saw in Dune, where the Harkonnen are supposed to leave Arrakis and the Atreides are coming in, then there's a judge of the change who's appointed by the Landsraad, appointed by the Emperor, rather. And they preside over the process and report back to the Emperor that everything that was sort of stipulated is being followed. Houses always respect the judge's authority, but they can challenge what he says. And then there's a sideline here about the War of Assassins, just stating that open warfare between houses is kind of frowned upon, except in extraordinary circumstances such as retaliation or when the Emperor himself sanctions it. And that's not something that happens very often. So you don't have kind of open warfare anymore. There is an ancient word that they use for this kind of modern conflict in this era called Kanli. And this is the art of vendetta. So basically this could be about a war of assassination between two houses, where you get yours by taking out a few key members of the other house. But it also could result in, basically, Kanli can go all the way to the destruction of a house completely. Usually ends in a lot of major deaths at the head of the house, so therefore the house might collapse at the end of it. So Kanli is a dangerous business. Then we get into summaries of the houses of the Imperium. So House Corino is the single most powerful house, and that's the house of the Imperial throne. Of course, they are incredibly wealthy. They don't get involved in certain things like the spice trade because they dare not shift the balance between the Imperial throne, the Landsraad, and the Spacing Guild. We have Harkonnen, who are brutal totalitarians, of course. We see their behavior in Dune. House Atreides, a well-respected house who was presided over by Duke Leto Atreides, whose son Paul we follow in the first book, of course. He's well-liked within his domain because he's thought to be wise, compassionate. He's also popular within the Landsraad as well. And the Emperor has noticed that he is kind of gaining more and more influence among other house leaders. We also have some outsiders, right? So we have Ix, who are kind of notorious for building technologies that come very close to the prohibition on thinking machines. And it's thought that they, at least in private, are flouting these regulations. What they say, the technology they offer to the broader Imperium is extremely useful. They develop non-sentient machines for industrial work, for example, but it's believed that they do some more unsavory stuff, perhaps, behind closed doors. Similarly, we have Tleylaks. They're viewed with a lot of suspicion because they are focused mainly on the manipulation of the human body. And they always have a sort of weirdly non-human look. Like, they look sort of normal, but they have weird features, and their teeth are always sharpened into like spiky fangs. And nobody knows if that's sort of bred into them or if they do it voluntarily. But nonetheless, it creates a creepy feeling. Their specialties include things like creating clones of dead people, which they call golas. And they've also created the face dancers, who are genetic eunuch shapeshifters. Basically, they can change their face and physiques to match the form of others, making them perfect spies, assassins, and operatives. And they're so good at collecting information, the Tleylaks, on a target, that they can, basically, most people won't notice even if their own mother was replaced by a face dancer. They're incredibly good at their job. So yeah, they're viewed generally with suspicion, and they are people are well aware that they exist and are always worried that somebody might unexpectedly be a face dancer, taking their house down from the inside. Yeah, they're also useful for, they can provide things like augmented eyes and limbs when you get injured and stuff like that. So both these groups are somewhat on the outside of things, but they are just skirting the edge of acceptability, and often slip over that edge for certain people. Then we have some details about CHOM, which stands for Combine Honnête Ober Advancer Mercantiles. Apparently, I never actually knew that. I just always called them CHOM. So all the houses, major and minor houses of the Landsraad, hold shares in CHOM, and they basically regulate all the transactions between houses over various goods. They have a board of directors. It's a whole big business thing. Of course, the most important single commodity that CHOM deals with is melange, the spice from Arrakis. At times, it's been extremely sparse and thus extremely valuable, depending on the level of production from Arrakis. And harvesting and refining the spice is very dangerous because Arrakis is filled with giant sandworms. They eat you all the time, and it's not an easy business. So, it is known that various houses try and hoard spice in case of shortages because it is so expensive. Then we have a little bit of discussion of economic realities. For example, a certain amount of graft and embezzlement is sort of expected and tolerated as a cost of doing business, as well as smuggling and piracy and so forth. And in fact, the Spacing Guild, often smuggling happens on the same ship where legitimate travel is happening with ships full of great houses. The Spacing Guild chapter is really fascinating, and they talk here in this sidebar about why smuggling is occasionally tolerated. Basically, they can charge exorbitant rates, but they keep studious records of everything, of every ship that is on board a Guild Hayliner. They're gigantic carrier ships that can carry thousands of smaller ships at once across the galaxy. They have very strict rules about what you can and can't do aboard those ships. And so basically nobody knows how they work. Nobody knows how they're laid out. Nobody knows how many crew they have. But to get on board and thus to get travel across the galaxy, which is extremely important to make profit and increase your influence, you need to deal with the guilds. And you basically will have to do what they say because you have no other options. Such as the power of having a monopoly on interstellar travel. Guild navigators are the particular sort of secret of the guild. They are very rarely seen by anybody outside of the guild. Basically, they are picked from childhood, it's believed, and they continually eat and breathe an atmosphere of spice. And through the process of this, they gradually become mutants. They kind of swell and become weird fish-like beings with bloated heads, super blue eyes from spice exposure. Their fingers lengthen and become fins, and they end up floating in suspensor fields within tanks, mobile tanks filled with spice gas. That actually, interestingly enough, the first depiction of guild navigators that we saw in Dune was from the original movie in the 80s. And it turned out that Frank Herbert liked it so much that he adopted that description in later books, which I thought was pretty cool. He felt that they really nailed what a guild navigator should look like. So they talk about how prescience works and helps the guild navigator use prescience to plot a course for faster than light travel. They can avoid gravitational anomalies, orbit, space debris. I mean, everything in the galaxy is moving all the time. So without knowledge of what could be in the way when you're folding your way across space, you will enter, very likely, a dangerous situation. So spice is critical to their ability to see into the future and avoid all that stuff. Then it talks about their policies, which I mentioned about how you must behave in a certain way aboard the ships. You can't interact with the broader ship. You can only stay on your ship. Any communication between your ship and another ship on the Highliner will be monitored. It's very, very strict. Then we start talking about the Mentats. So there's a whole backstory here, which I won't get into because you should discover that for yourself. But basically, the Mentats are usually the trusted advisors of any noble house. They ingest the juice of sappho, which is found from a plant harvested on the planet Ekaz, and it's made into a sort of liquid stimulant. And it can highly amplify the already prodigious mental abilities of a Mentat. So it's also very addictive. So you can see that a Mentat is using sappho by telltale red stains on their lips. Becoming a Mentat is a huge deal. They're extremely in demand, obviously, because they can do everything that a computer could do, but actually some things better. And there is such a thing as twisted Mentats. So the Bene Tleilax, who we learned about before, they have the ability to create Mentats that have no moral or ethical constraints. So not only do they have all the abilities of standard Mentat, they're also extremely good at being, say, assassinators or planning horrible intrigues and so forth. Then we have the Bene Gesserit. So we have their organizational hierarchy laid out. We have a great thematic image here of a woman fully dressed in Bene Gesserit black with a veil over the face and a hidden dagger, which just sets the mood perfectly. So Mother Superior runs the sisterhood. The Reverend Mother is a member who has survived the spice agony, where you're poisoned deliberately and you have to use your internal biochemical control to neutralize the poison and turn it into harmless water. And if you succeed, you gain access to the genetic memory of the entire sisterhood. So you suddenly have access to an enormous amount of knowledge and power. Prior to that, you're a sister, and then you sort of advance along the way. The Kwisatz Mother is kind of a special role. There's the Truth Sayers, who some Reverend Mothers can enter like a trance where they can basically tell perfectly whether somebody is lying or not. Traditionally, the emperors have kept a Truth Sayer near them at all times. Not every Reverend Mother has that ability, but some can enter that trance at will. Some need to enter the trance with assistance of a drug. Sisters don't have necessarily all the abilities of a Reverend Mother, but they do have prana bindu control, which is basically they have complete control over their body and biochemistry. And initiates are those who are just starting their training, but are still probably going to be more dangerous than you might expect. So then we have the history and agenda of the Bene Gesserit. We talk about the training. The other thing you'll have seen in the film is their use of the voice. So by modulating the pitch, timbre, and cadence of their voice, a trained member of the Bene Gesserit can basically force somebody to follow their commands. It's an extremely powerful ability, but it can be resisted by people who are deaf, other Reverend Mothers, or like particularly strong-willed Mentats and stuff like that. But most normal people are completely susceptible to it. And it can be extremely powerful. You can force somebody to harm somebody else. So, it can also save a life. So it's a double-edged sword in that sense. They also have, internal biochemical control. They're extremely observant, the Bene Gesserit. So they're very good at noticing things that nobody else can notice. They're very good at spying and social manipulation, including using anything up to and including seduction. And they can also communicate in hidden ways. So they use hand signs or coded dots that nobody else knows the meaning of to communicate when in the company of non-sisters. They talk about the truth trance, details of the spice agony, how they have a sort of universal reach across the much of the Imperium, and their attitude, or how they're perceived by the others in the galaxy. They're highly visible, so they don't hide themselves very often. They're kind of discreet. Many view them as kind of slightly creepy witch types, but often you need them, so it's a little bit of a difficult situation. They get into the Suk Medical School. So lots of people try to get admitted because being a Sook doctor is extremely in demand, much like being a Bene Gesserit sister. But not everybody has the aptitude or the ability to sustain the conditioning. And the Imperial conditioning is an unbreakable psychological inhibition against causing harm to a patient. It takes years and is a result of intense guided manipulation by the school specialists. Basically, they are subjected to lengthy rhetorical interrogation and subliminal direction. These can last for more than 36 hours and utilize exhaustion to further condition the subject. During their final years of study at the inner school, a doctoral candidate will be subjected to conditioning sessions even in their sleep. And many people die during this process. If you survive all that, then you can become a Sook doctor. And they are basically in demand by all the great powers of the Landsraad as personal physicians, but also as medical overseers for larger groups like armies and so forth, because they can always be trusted. Pretty much. Then we get into the Bene Tleilax and their face dancers. The new supplement, which is on its way to my house as we speak, which deals with the broader Dune universe, including more details on the Imperium, the home of the Emperor on Kaitan, will apparently allow players to become face dancers, which is pretty cool. I don't know if they'll be able to be Twisted Mentats as well, but being a face dancer would definitely be fun. And in fact, they used some house rules to do that in I think it was a 10-part series on Glass Cannon Network on this game, which was really a lot of fun. I highly recommend watching that on YouTube if you can find. I'll put a link in the description basically, but they didn't quite get the rules in the first session, but they start clearing things up later on. And they let one of their guys be a face dancer and came up with some rules for that, and it worked pretty well. But I'm sure the official stuff will be way more in depth. We also get some info about the other things that Tleilaxu provide, such as prosthetic eyes, which are creepy and made out of metal, but they basically fully restore vision to normal, even though they look not normal. And of course the Golas, which we see a number of in the series as it goes on. Then we see some details on the Swordmasters of Ginaz, how they train, and how they're not just trained in the use of weaponry, but also the art of war in itself. And they do have a great fixation on honor, so basically it's not just about winning, it's about winning sort of honorably and in a fluid and elegant way. So you shouldn't just stab somebody until they die, you should defeat them with refinement, basically. There are no recorded encounters of Ginaz Swordmaster against a large number of Sardaukar, and there is some speculation over whether the individual flair and skill of the Swordmaster would eventually fail when placed against the relentless advance of the Emperor's soldier fanatics. So that's still an open question, who would prevail. Now we have a great section on key aspects of major planets in the Imperium, which, of course, the biggest section is on Arrakis. It's considered habitable class 3, so humans can survive with environmental precautions. I think that's a little bit generous, because at least in the deep desert, only the Fremen can survive, basically. So they talk a lot about the environment of Arrakis, of course, the extremity of the extreme aridity, the difficulty of surviving, the sort of lack of any form of precipitation. So water is extremely precious. Flora and fauna are very limited. We do have some life forms like scorpions and types of centipedes. But of course, Arrakis is famous for the sandworms, which can be up to 400 meters long and all but unstoppable unless you use atomics or something like that. So in the game, they're just presented as like a force of nature. You can't kill a sandworm. They're just you might be able to ride them if you're a Fremen and you're really good, but they will gobble up your harvester and kill everybody inside, and there's really not much you can do about it. And that's realistic. I mean, that fits the setting perfectly well. They should. This is one of those things. Sandworms should not have stats. Because anything that has stats, players will find a way to kill it. But it does give you some. Well, you need to know that a worm is coming. So first, you feel the tremble of the earth, even when the worm is kilometers away. Then you see a worm sign, the bulge in the sand as it drives towards its target. Then you get the scent of the sandworm, which is unmistakable. And it's something like cinnamon and something like flint struck against flint. The odor is highly distinctive and fills the air near where the worm is to emerge. And then the final indication is lightning. So when the sandworm is about to breach the surface, the speed of the sandworm generates a huge amount of friction, which creates static lightning that dances over the sand. So, all in all, very terrifying. Then we get some details on the cities of Arrakis, which are mainly Arrakeen, the capital, and Carthage, which was constructed by House Harkonnen. and was for many generations prior the capital's largest city. But then Carthage was kind of rebuilt to suit their own aesthetic preferences. Yeah, so they talk a bit about the characteristics of these two cities, and politics on Arrakis, which is, of course, a huge deal and involves the whole galaxy because everybody wants the spice. And then we have details on the Fremen, including their values and their extreme dedication to water. So, if you have a duel with a Fremen and somebody loses, their body is converted to water through their specialized process called a death still. So water is all important. Fremen live a long time because they breathe in the spice all the time. But life can be brutal as well. Survival is very difficult in the deep desert, particularly. But thankfully, they developed the wonderful still suit technology, which converts even your urine and feces back into potable water. Not pleasant to drink, apparently, but a still suit in good repair will lose less than a thimbleful of your body's water a day. So you can survive potentially for weeks in the deep desert with no supplies. They also invented the still tent, which is kind of a multi-person version of the still suit used to stay overnight in the desert. And they're designed to resist, provide protection from sandworms and provide shelter from the hazards of the desert. Talks about the Siege, which is both the place where a tribe of Fremen live and the community within that area. So it's kind of a dual-purpose word. The Fremen belief system, their attitude to warfare, and the famous crysknife. The crysknife is a special dagger made from the teeth of a sandworm. They're very precious to the Fremen, and they have a number of rules about their use. The two famous rules about them are, one, a crysknife cannot be drawn unless it sees the spilling of blood afterwards, and second, that it must never be exposed to an outsider except during battle. And by the way, they call the sandworm Shai Hulud, which means something like old man of the desert, and they view the sandworms as essentially part of God. Then we get into a little bit about Caladan, which was originally the planet of the Atreides. A relatively humble planet, all things considered. They exported basic foodstuffs and things like that, but it's a not very pleasant environment. Mostly water. 70% of the surface is water. And there's a little bit of details about points of interest there. Then we have Gedi Prime, the horrible, polluted world of the Harkonnens. They give no shits about polluting the atmosphere with industry, so they just go ahead and do that. Then we have the system of Ix, where the Ixians make their base. Apparently, nearly 90% of Ixians live in subterranean caves. And the only people who go above surface are kind of the people who sort of greet visitors, whether willing or unwilling. The capital city is the underground city of Vernii, and the nobles live on the level closest to the surface, and the workers and lower castes live down below. The underground cities are supported by diamond pillars. That's pretty cool. Then we have Junction, which is the headquarters of the Spacing Guild, and basically the culture of Junction is more relaxed than one would imagine. I find that interesting. It's a grassland ecosystem that once had numerous green fields, but now most of those fields are concrete and metal landing ships for Guild spacecraft, repair shops, and the massive Guild bank. It also has the only known navigator school in the whole universe, and they get many specially selected citizens from around the galaxy come to Junction in hopes of one day becoming navigators, but of course many will fail. It's not an easy life to live. Then we have Kaitan, which is the homeworld of the Emperor. It's a planet filled with natural beauty. The capital planet is a picturesque world of grace, opulence, and abundance. Immense buildings of glass and metal reach skyward with breathtaking art displayed throughout each city. So a perfect place to build the imperial capital city. Then we have Puritrin. So this is largely an agricultural supported world. The local noble house is the Maros. And it seems that they serve basically primarily exporting agricultural goods, and they serve the Imperium as a supply location for enslaved people. So it's not very nice. Then we have Richezi. They are, or were, competition with Ix for producing starships and sophisticated machines. But eventually the Ixians kind of spread themselves too thin in an economic war with Ixian House Vernius. So they spiraled into bankruptcy. And then later, Emperor Shaddam IV, who is current in this timeline in the book, destroyed their moon, Corona, which was basically the centerpiece of House Richezi's illegal spice trade. So, yeah, they're in a bad state. Then we have some little bits about Salusa Secundus. This is a world that was basically bombed to hell during the war and is sort of barely capable of sustaining life, but only the strongest can survive. And this is allegedly where the Emperor Sardaukar have their training. Then we have Tleilax, which is where the Bene Tleilax live. They're highly religious and isolationist. The holy city of Bandalong is exclusively for Tleilaxu, and there is an unsanctioned Mentat training center, which is the only one in the galaxy that produces twisted Mentats, of course. Then we have Wallach 9, so this is also called Chapter House, and this is the home for the Bene Gesserit and serves as their greatest training facility. Most sisters of the Bene Gesserit will visit Chapter House at some point or another, either to learn something of importance or to gain an assignment. So, yeah, extremely important for a Bene Gesserit to visit. Then we get into the rules, finally. So you can create houses of various different levels. In the beginning of the game, they recommend that GMs and players sit down, decide what kind of house they want to play. So a nascent house, they've just acquired minor house status. They're kind of just entering the world of this kind of feudalistic society. They could be a house minor, which is a vassal house that serves a major house. So they might be, constantly jockeying for power and influence with their house major, rivaling for their favor. The house major is the ruling power of a whole planet. And then the great house is one of the greatest powers in the universe, basically. So if you wanted to be on the level of the Harkonnens or the Atreides, then you would be a great house. Then you would want to choose, and depending on the type of house, by the way, the greater the house, the more threat the GM gains at the start of a session. So if you have a great house, you have many enemies, so the GM gets 3 threat per player at the start of the session. House minor, you get 1 threat per player. If you're a new nascent house, there's no starting threat because nobody knows who you are. Then you want to choose your domains for your house. So depending on the size of your house and its greatness, you'll gain primary domains and secondary domains. And these are kind of your areas of expertise, and they're divided into kind of subcategories. And within those, there are different types of outputs. So basically, you might be machinery related to that area, produce, expertise, workers, or understanding. So it gives these different domains and then examples of each of those categories. So we have artistic domains, espionage, farming, industrial, Kanli, which is the War of Assassins, of course, military, political, and it gives wonderful examples of each of those different types of things. There's a sidebar here about people as resources. And again, we can have house domain in religion or science as well. Then you want to choose your home world, which could be a place that you make up, because there's a lot of open space in the Imperium to create a new world. Or it could be that you play an established house that's mentioned in the fiction. It's all up to you. Then you choose your banner and coat of arms, which they emblazon on all their holdings to remind everybody of who they are. And then you choose your traits. So basically, if you're a player and a member of that house, and you spend a momentum, you can apply that house trait to your character for the remainder of the scene. And you can do that for as many house traits as you like. So each house begins with a trait for any primary domains it has, and is the same as the area of expertise for that domain. And each house also begins with a descriptive trait for its reputation. This might be honorable, like the Atreides, or brutal, like the Harkonnen. This trait details the way the rest of the Imperium sees your house and expects its agents to behave. Other traits may be gained or lost during play, usually after an important event that changes their reputation in the Imperium. Then we go through the different roles that are necessary for a house to run. So you need the leader of the house. They'll hold a noble title like Duke Leto Atreides, for example. Their consort will be their spouse, concubine, or companion of the ruler. But as we saw in Dune, the consort, Lady Jessica of Duke Leto, they really loved each other. They were in a proper relationship. It wasn't just an arrangement. Then you have advisors, which would often be somebody like a Mentat or a Bene Gesserit. A chief physician, which if you're very rich would be a Suk doctor as your chief physician. The counselor will be the person who connects the ruler to the people, sorting through and passing the requests of the citizenry to the ruler. You have an envoy who would be a diplomat, so they would try to ensure peaceful relations with the house, their rivals, representatives of Chom Directorate, the Landsraad, the Bene Gesserit, the Space and Guild, etc. The heir will be the ruler's eldest child, And then you have a marshal who enforces the house's laws, kind of the police chief. The scholar will be the representative for higher learning, tending to science and academia on the ruler's behalf. You have the spy master, of course, who will have a network of spies, assassins, and informants, both at home and elsewhere, trying to make sure the house's standing is maintained, and that they have both intelligence and counterintelligence. Then you'll have a sword master, or sometimes called a weapon master. They will be a military advisor and bodyguard to the ruler. You'll have a treasurer, who's the main finance officer, and the war master, who is the house general, basically. And then when you build your house, you need to have some enemies, right? So they give you great tables to roll up some enemies on. Of course, the bigger your house, bigger deal your house is, the more enemies you have to roll. So you roll a d20 to determine why they hate you. Could be just general dislike. Could be that they think they're a rival in your specialty. They loathe you and want to do serious damage to you, but they won't risk their own resources to do so. Or it could be Kanli, so basically they want your house to cease to exist. And what's the reason for that hate? It could be competition, a reputational slight, you have a debt or an ancient feud, family ties, jealousy, or even could be no reason, nobody remembers. There's just a thousands of year old hatred that nobody really knows the origins of. I think that's quite realistic as well. Now we have a lovely picture here of what looks like somebody looking out over Arrakis, perhaps. And this is about creating your character. So we can skip through a lot of this because it's quite similar to the other 2D20 games. The difference being that the character archetypes and supporting characters are going to be fitting into the themes of Dune, of course. Similar to Star Trek, you have major NPCs, notable NPCs, and minor NPCs, which are kind of like minions. These are incidental enemies. Notable NPCs are kind of experts and agents of rival houses, and major NPCs are powerful, important people, so equivalent to the player characters or superior to them. So the first question is your concept. Do you want to be a Mentat advisor? Do you want to be heir to the throne of your house? Do you want to be a Bene Gesserit agent, a physician, a smuggler? All kinds of stuff are available to you. And there are two methods of creation. One is to do it sort of pre-planned, and one is to do it in play, so that allows things to happen more quickly. That's handy if you want somebody to kind of jump into a game that's already in progress, but planned creation is probably preferred because it allows for a kind of collaborative creation between the GM and the players. So in the game you have your personal traits, which consist of your skills, and these are divided into, you've got battle, communicate, discipline, move, and understand. And so you will have a rating in there between 4 and 8. 8 is the highest, and that means you're a master of that skill, renowned for your expertise. And like in Star Trek, you can have focuses. So this allows you to demonstrate your specialties and advanced expertise in certain areas. So in this case, when you're, as in Star Trek, if you're rolling your test and you use your focus applies, then you will be able to have any roll that is under the focus for that skill value will count as a dual success, basically. And they give loads of great examples for battle focuses, communicate, which includes things like deceit, charm, disguise, gossip, innuendo, etc. Example, discipline foci. Example, understand foci. Now, in Dune, you have drives, which are kind of like values, I guess, in Star Trek. So there are also 5 of these. You got duty, faith, justice, power, and truth. It tells you what each of those are. Basically, these are not something that you kind of roll for. With skills, you get extra points that you can put in after you put in your main priorities. But then with drives, you basically, one of your drives is at 8, which is your most high priority, and you have an 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, and you spread those out between your drives. And basically, your 6, 7, and 8 drives will have a drive statement attached to them, I believe. Yeah, each with a rating of 6 or higher. You define a single drive statement, which will be an example of how you feel about duty, faith, justice, power, or truth. And similar to Star Trek, if you do something which is aligning with your accompanying drive statement, then that's all good. But if you're clashing with your drive statement, then you may suffer complications or be required to give up that drive statement through basically a similar process where your values change. And there's various consequences for that. but it's an interesting part of character growth in this game. You also want to have your character's ambitions, which can change over time, so they might be related to any of these drives as well. You might want to uncover hidden knowledge, you might want to gain power, you might want to fight for justice in the galaxy, or be of true and great service to your house, all that kind of stuff. Then we go to the planned character creation. So they give you a nice summary here on the sidebar. We won't go into the details of it, but they give you some nice sort of templates here to start with. So you want to be a Bene Gesserit sister. You have some mandatory talents that you have to take. Prana Bindu conditioning. You'll have an additional trait called Bene Gesserit, and suggested archetypes, which we'll get into later. Fremen, likewise, they need to have a mandatory talent of at least one of the following: dedication, driven, master at arms, rapid recovery, resilience, brackets battle, subtle step, the reason I fight. So a huge number of choices. If you're a Mentat, you have the trait of Mentat. You have certain archetypes recommended for you, and you must choose from calculated precision, Mentat discipline, mind palace, twisted Mentat, or verify in place of one of your other talents. You can also be a spacing guild agent. You have a mandatory talent of Guildsman and the trait of Guild Agent. Souk Doctor, you have the additional trait of Souk Doctor and a mandatory talent of Imperial Conditioning. So then you have the archetypes. So each archetype is chosen for your character and provides a single trait representing the character's role or status. It'll mark a skill as primary and secondary, and you'll get 2 focuses for your primary or secondary skill, and there are suggestions for those. And the archetypes are all summarized here. So what's their primary skill, what's their secondary skill. And you get a single talent as well, according to your archetype. And they're divided into subcategories. So battle archetypes are war masters. You can be a duelist, sergeant, tactician, or warrior. Socialite, you could be a commander, envoy, courtier, or steward. Each will have different talents suiting these special roles in the house. For discipline archetypes, you can be an analyst, herald, infiltrator, or protector. As an adept, which is kind of a move archetype, you could be an athlete, scout, a messenger, or a smuggler, which is quite interesting. And finally, for understand, you're kind of in the academic world, so you can be empathetic, you can be a scholar, you can be a spy, or a strategist. Then you get into your skills. So again, skills are rated between 4 and 8. The primary skill for your archetype is at 6, secondary is at 5, the other 3 are at 4, and then you have 5 points that you can distribute in any way, which way you want. But you can never go above 8. And then you will choose your focuses. Then you'll choose your talents as well. Starting player character will have 3 talents. So your chosen archetype provides 1, and it'll suggest several options which are appropriately thematic for that archetype. And then you'll have some talents that are restricted to a particular background. So, for example, the Bene Gesserit has to choose as one of the talents Prana Bindu conditioning, but you could also choose other Bene Gesserit talents like hyper awareness, for example. You're not limited to just that one. Then the next step is to do your drives and drive statements. Then each starting character should have 3 assets as well. Assets help you in all different kinds of conflict, and they could be intangible stuff like information, blackmail stuff, that kind of thing, or they could be things like having an ornithopter or a knife or a sword, but they should be something special. They shouldn't just be a bog standard example of that. Then finishing touches for your character, you'll pick one additional trait reflecting their reputation and how they're regarded by others. You'll pick their ambitions and their personal details like name, personality, appearance, relationships. So, how's your character get along with the rest of the house? All that. Throughout, they have a great example of character called Cara Molay, I guess, who is a commander archetype. And as we get through the process, we see the final result here in her character sheet. So it really helps you understand how to go through the process. You can see that she was Bene Gesserit trained, so she has that as a trait. She's also noble and honorable. Her ambition is to become a secret master assassin. She has focuses in short blaze, diplomacy and inspiration, and stealth. She's got 3 drive statements, 3 talents, hyper-awareness, masterful innuendo, and Prana Bindu conditioning. And her assets, she's got blackmail evidence, which she can decide what it is at the time of use, a concealable knife, and a personal ornithopter she can use for travel on planet. It's pretty cool. But yeah, the writing in this book is really excellent for the new player and GM alike. The next chapter is just a huge list of talents. which I'm just going to skip through, basically. Then we have the second method of character creation, which is creation in play, which is easier to run, but basically the planned creation, I think, is, like I said, definitely preferable. Like Star Trek, you have the ability to create supporting characters. So they allow you to be in a scene that your character would normally not be in. Like if you're the spy master and you want to be part of a scene on a planet that has nothing to do with espionage, supporting characters can allow you a way in. You can use momentum and stuff to create supporting characters. You can also create notable supporting characters for 3 points of momentum or 3 points to threat to create a new one, plus any additional costs incurred during the creation process. And, it gives you all the details of how to generate them. And, you can add a little bit to the cost. For example, if you want to have like an additional +1 in momentum cost, you can get +1 to 2 skills. For an extra +2, you can have a second talent, for et cetera, et cetera. So again, really easy to work with. Character advancement is a little bit interesting. Basically, you gain advancement points by facing adversity. So if you are defeated during conflict, you gain an advancement point from the pain of failure. If you fail a test with a difficulty of 3 or higher, you gain an advancement point. Or you gain an advancement point when the GM spends 4 or more points of threat against you. You also, if you support your ambition with a skill test, then you'll gain an ambition. Or if you do something really that impresses the group, something really creative, then you can gain an advancement point. And you can use those points to increase your skills. You can purchase additional focus for any skill rated 6 or higher. You can purchase additional talents for a number of points equal to 3 times the number of talents you already have, so it's quite expensive. You can select an asset to make permanent if you created a temporary one. Alternatively, you can work on one of your existing assets, adding one to its quality. You can also retrain, so you can change a skill, change out a focus, or change out a talent. So quite a few different options for character advancement, and it's a little bit more fluid than in something like Star Trek, where, they fixed that in the Klingon rulebook to a certain degree. But yeah, I think the advancement rules work well for Dune here. Then we have the general rules, which are pretty much what we're used to seeing in 2D6 by this point. They really emphasize the use of traits in this game. A lot more than in Star Trek, so I think that's a good thing. Traits add interest to scenes. You can add social traits to characters. If you fail a roll, for example, maybe they're now distrustful, which makes further interactions more difficult. Traits allow for a lot of fluidity and interesting creativity in making a scene become increasingly complex to navigate. And that's great for GMs as well. And GMs can, of course, use threat to create traits as well. So they give some great examples here. So Kara's player basically is trying to navigate a difficult social situation. And we see her do various skill tests, using momentum. We see an example of using assistance in tests, of using various momentum spends. We have some example complications for GMs who have trouble thinking of ones on their feet. Then we have as in Star Trek, the possibility of extending the complication range. So normally a complication occurs if you roll a 20, but you can extend that if the task is particularly risky or unpredictable. You can also allow success at a cost, which would be 1 or more complications for the character. So that's up to the GM discretion, though. Then we have a chapter on threat. So, of course, characters can pay the GM threat instead of momentum as a way of gaining extra dice on a test or building traits or whatever at the same rate they would spend momentum. But then, of course, the GM can use that threat in return. So you're paying to succeed now for a later bit of horror to strike. And, of course, there are various ways that the GM can spend threat, including, increasing difficulty, creating complications, creating new traits, changing, removing, or creating traits, changing environmental effects, narrative changes, or you can introduce a known enemy house to the situation, which I think is really interesting. That definitely will have a way of spicing things up, no pun intended. Then there's the use of determination, which is, again, very similar to Star Trek. So you can use a point of determination to get an automatic 1 in your dice pool, so you already have 2 successes from the outset. Or you can use it to re-roll any number of d20s, or before or after rolling, you can use it to create a new trait or change or remove an existing one, but it must relate to your character. But it could be something which has always been the case, but is only being revealed now, and then you can sort of retcon it into the storyline. or in a conflict, you can immediately take an extra action even if you already kept the initiative. So that's useful. And they note that with momentum, threat, and determination, it seems like a lot of stuff to keep track of, but basically it allows you a lot of different strategies to try and make certain important roles happen when we really need them to, but there's always a risk-reward situation going on. This details as well how if you comply with your drive, when you try to do something against it, then you will suffer a complication, and basically you don't get to do the action that was against your drive. If you challenge your drive, you can act freely, but you have to cross out that drive, and then you can't use that drive score again until you've recovered, and there's certain situations where you can do that. Then we have contested roles, extended tasks. Extended tasks are interesting as well because basically combat is super fast in this game. If you're fighting somebody and you win the contested role, they're basically like out. Not necessarily dead, but they're out of the conflict. They're defeated. Player characters and major NPCs can resist defeat to get back to their feet, but they may end up with injuries and stuff like that. And there are 5 types of conflict in the game. We have dueling, skirmishes, warfare, espionage, and intrigue. So dueling is a one-on-one duel between individuals using swords, daggers, needles, other stuff, and usually personal shielding. It could be a formalized duel, it could be an assassination attempt, or just a one-on-one bout for some reason. Skirmishes are battles between several characters at once, with several combatants. Warfare is strategic level, so that's where we're, sending out assets like entire armies and artillery and stuff. Espionage is stealth and deception, trying to gain information, steal valuable things, or perform assassinations. Intrigue is social conflict, so that's where you're trying to drag out secrets and hidden agendas from people. You're trying to discover what others know or what they want. So these are all different forms of conflict, and all of them can benefit from similar things. So, and the basics of conflict applies here to pretty much everything. You can use tangible assets and intangible assets. The quality of that asset, which ranges from 0 to 4, basically offers a bonus. And then conflict works in zones, and that includes things like espionage and intrigue, where you'll sort of gradually put together an intrigue map of who's linked to who and what information they may have as you succeed in tests and start to uncover the complexities of a given social situation. So zones are used even in sort of non-physical combat in this game. I talk about how to take actions, which can include moving an asset subtly or boldly, using an asset in different ways. Some things you can't do in a single action. So if your foe in a combat, for example, is a major character, that basically becomes an extended task, and you need to defeat them multiple times. You can't do it just in one attack. And again, there's copious examples here, very well put together. Sidebar on resisting defeat. So you cost 1 point of momentum or 1 threat, and you suffer a complication. So that could be like a loss of an asset, an advantage that the enemy gets over you, or some hindrance like an injury or wound that resulted from the defeat. You can also target assets. You can create traits or assets to be used just in the conflict. You can overcome obstacles. You can gain information, and you can aid an ally, which we saw examples of earlier, in fact. Dueling is probably the more interesting in that you've got this kind of weird setup where each participant has their physical body as the target. Then you have 2 guard zones where you can move different assets, and those can be, defensive assets like personal shield, which could be a half or a full shield, and they will have physical weapons, melee weapons, or subtle weapons like poison needles hidden in your clothing, stuff like that. So yeah, a lot of the rules for the different types of conflict are quite similar, but dueling is the one that seems to cause a bit of confusion. There's a nice guide that you can find out there that summarizes how dueling really works in practice. I'll try to find the link to that and put it in the description, but if you watch there's a duel that happens in the Glass Cannon Network game, and it's kind of close enough. If you get the right vibe and it feels like a duel, then I think you're being mostly successful. Then there's a section on skirmish conflicts. Then I have espionage. So the use of zones in espionage is when you start to discover who's connected with whom. And the further you go along in those zones, the closer you'll get to the knowledge and power that you need. And the people counteracting you in these actions will be possibly enemy spies, informants, surveillance devices, security measures, and their attacks and espionage are different, obviously, than attacks during physical conflict, as is defeat. And you can target assets or create assets to help you. So again, a lot of the rules are similar, but the context is very different. In warfare, you need to worry about a much larger scale. So you'll think about zones being things like the gates to a city, or a main road, or a useful kind of bit of higher territory, something like that. And typically, you need to set an objective for victory. So it's not just going to be a fight to the death, last person with nobody left wins, but it's going to be controlling a particular zone, like you're going to capture the palace in Arrakis or whatever. Then it gives you a list of different types of assets: ground troops, ground vehicles, aircraft, fortifications. Again, you have different types of movements and attacks, defeats, targeting assets, all this kind of stuff. Then we get into intrigue. So this is our social conflict. And when you go into a social conflict, the character will have a certain disposition. If they're allied to you, then the difficulty will be lesser. If they're unfriendly or opposed to you, the difficulty will be higher. And you can use trade and secrets. So you could use valuables, rumors and lies, intangible assets, basically, to try and gain an advantage. And attacks will be, again, different than what you would expect in espionage or warfare or the other aspects. And they give a lovely example here about our character we saw earlier, Kara, trying to see if a rumor of an affair can gain her leverage in a role-playing scene, which is pretty cool. And again, you can target assets, create assets, overcome obstacles, etc. Then we have a chapter on assets themselves. So tangible assets are a little trickier to deal with than intangible, because intangible assets can be created in almost any situation because they represent things like information, contacts, favors, whatever. Tangible assets like knives, guns, whatever, you need to find them or build them somewhere, and so they can't necessarily be created in the middle of a scenario in a certain condition. And then talks about asset quality and what that does for you. And basically it determines how effective the asset is when used in a conflict. And you can use your character advancement points to improve your quality of assets. Then we talk about the different kinds of assets. So ranged weapons like laser guns, mola pistols. Melee weapons like blades, crysknives, kinjals, pulse swords, armors, shields. Personal stuff like connections to the communinet, which is the kind of galactic version of the internet, I suppose. Emergency transmitter, a damper, which sort of protects the privacy of conversations. Tools like glow globes, frem kits for survival in the desert. Dew collectors to try and get water on Arrakis. Poison snoopers, maker hooks, all kinds of stuff. Thumpers to attract worms. Then we have warfare assets, which could be house shields, fortresses, bunkers, conscript soldiers, shield infantry, specialists and elite troops, including Fedaykin and Sardaukar, transports, naval transports, ornithopters, artillery and anti-aircraft stuff, so rocket missile launchers, ornithopters, and then other vehicles are noted here like spice harvesters, orbital transports, hayliners. Basically, to take control of a hayliner is kind of unheard of unless you're in the Spacing Guild, but as it says in the text, strange things have happened. And then we have espionage assets. So this is cool stuff like poison dart guns, hunter seekers, poison tooth, garrots, slit tips. So it's a poison coated blade, drugs, poisons. Then we have communicative assets like Bene Gesserit coded dots, interrogation techniques, Shiga wire, espionage assets with things like assassins, corporate spies, face dancers, Mentat, master of assassins, political spies. For intrigue, you'll have assets like debtors, old friendships, services, valuables like land rights, manufactured goods, raw materials, supply contracts. For intrigue, you'll have blackmail, hostages, illicit recordings, stolen files, contacts like black market traders, courtesans, ex-agents. As a courtier, you could have an ambitious newcomer, House Retainer, you could be a confidant of the Emperor. You might have a politician as an asset. Then we get into the game mastering stuff. There's some really cool tips in here for creating a campaign. How to think about, one-shots versus 3-chapter minor arcs versus longer arcs or campaigns. Hot tips for using published campaigns, of which we already have 2. The Agents of Dune box set and the Masters of Dune follow-up. There's loads of tables as well for rolling up story hooks if you need to throw together something quickly. Creating NPCs, the ideal setup for a game, running a game, getting through your first scene. And there's a lot of talk about the themes of Dune and the problems that are posed by some of the themes of Dune, such as prescience, like knowing the future, expanded perception, and hyper-awareness. And then we have this really great section of allies and adversaries. So we have main characters of the series statted up, like Leto Atreides, Paul Atreides, Gurney Halleck, Thufir Hawat, Dr. Yue, Duncan Idaho. We have some Harkonnen fellows, including Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, the most disgusting man in the universe, Peter de Vries, the Beast Raban. We have House Carino, so the Emperor himself, Shaddam IV, Princess Irulan, Count Fenrig, Liet Kynes. We have some Fremen, Naib, and Chani, of course, from the book. And then some hot tips on making NPCs, making them believable, and making sure they don't overwhelm the story. Like, make them believable as a person, but make the player characters the main focus. And then this is probably my favorite section as a longtime GM. Just loads of templates for useful NPCs. Arrakis native, assassin, Bene Gesserit agent, Reverend Mother, criminal, courtiers, envoys, Fremen elder, face dancer, guild agents, warriors, merchants, mentats, everything. Scientists, Sardaukar, smugglers, servants, technicians, spies, water sellers, Tleilaxu. Look how creepy that dude is. And then setting up rival houses for your house as well. So really, everything you can ask for as a GM is hooked up to here. And then you have the opening adventure, which we will skip entirely. So yeah, it's a fantastic core rulebook. I would say, although the GM stuff is great, you really do need to give a shit about Dune to get the most out of this game, because they do give you a lot of background, but I think if you haven't read the books or at least seen the movie, then it won't have the same impact for you. But yeah, it's a wonderful core rulebook. In the next video on the RPG system, I think I'll look at, first of all, the GM kit, which is really, really valuable, actually. Has even more great stuff for the GMs out there, not least as the screen itself, along with one of the supplements, and then we'll go from there. I've got, like I said, the latest supplement on the Emperor, Pawns and Powers, is coming shortly. So look forward to some more videos over the coming weeks and months. In the meantime, if you have any questions about the Dune game system, my experiences with it, or any of the supplements that you want to see in particular, let me know, and I'll prioritize based on what you guys say in the comments. In the meantime, have fun, stay well, and remember, as always, fear is the mind killer. Take care. Bye-bye.